Okay, so we're going to review some angle properties today. So I want you to make sure you have this piece of paper in front of you. And when we have angles, we have 5 huge new vocabulary words that we want to focus on. So the first one is complementary angles. So complementary angles, they are 2 or more angles that add up to 90 degrees. So complementary angles can be 2 or more angles as long as they add up to make a 90-degree angle, which is a right angle. So I remember complementary angle because my 2 small angles make my right angle. And how I can guarantee that this is a right angle is because of this little box that's right here in the corner. Okay? Supplementary angles. Supplementary angles are 2 or more angles that add up to 180 degrees. Okay? Notice I have these 2 angles and they make a straight line. So how I remember complementary is it makes a 90-degree angle, which I think sometimes looks like a chair. Supplementary angles mean I have 2 angles that make a straight line. So sometimes when I'm having to look at really complicated problems like were on your homework last night, I like to draw semicircles to see if it makes a supplementary angle. So if I were to connect this angle and draw an arc, right? And then from that other angle, if I were to draw another arc, notice it makes a half circle. If it makes a half circle, that means these 2 angles can be added up to 180 degrees. Some people have a hard time remembering complementary versus supplementary. So I want you to think about it. What comes first in the ABCs? C or S? C does, right? So if I put C and S, stack them on top like that. Now think about it logically. What number comes first, 90 or 180? 90 does, so it goes with C. 180 does, so it goes with S. Just a fun little cheat shortcut way to differentiate between complementary and supplementary. Okay? So let's now go over to adjacent angles. What does adjacent mean? It means next to. If you look at the person who's adjacent to you in your desks right now, those people are next to you. So adjacent, they're angles that are next to each other. But how we can help us remember it a little more, they are angles that share a vertex and a side. Okay? More known, the side is basically a ray. Okay? So if I look at my 2 angles right here, notice these 2 angles share this common vertex. Notice they also share that ray or that side, which makes them adjacent. They're sitting next to each other. All right? Vertical angles. Vertical angles, they are angles formed by intersecting lines. Okay? So notice when my 2 lines intersect, I have angles that are formed. Now there's something special about these angles. Angles formed by intersecting lines where opposite angles are congruent. So the angle opposite to 1 is 3, and the angle opposite to 2 is 4. Those angles are congruent. So I would say angle 1 is congruent to angle 3, and angle 2 is congruent to angle 4. Now, when I was learning this, I sometimes had a hard time seeing what opposite meant. My teacher drew fish out of my vertical angles. And yes, I'm an excellent drawer. But if I draw a fish here, and I draw a fish here, okay, notice my fish are kissing. So how I remember vertical angles, they are opposite angles because they make fish that kiss. Linear pair is kind of a redundant vocabulary word. Math, they love to give you multiple words that mean the exact same thing. Okay? Notice linear pair looks a lot like supplementary because they are. The only difference between supplementary and linear is that linear pair are always adjacent. Okay? There are always only 2 angles. supplementary, I could have 3 or more angles that add up to 180 degrees. That does not make them linear. That does not make them a linear pair. So a linear pair, they are 2 adjacent angles that make 180 degrees. Okay? So, again, when I'm looking to determine if something is a linear pair, I'm going to try drawing my half semicircle. So, going from one arc to the other arc, making one arc on this angle, and then I'm going to make another arc on my other angle. Notice when I connect the two, they make a semicircle. Because it makes a semicircle, that means I can make them equal to 180. This seems a little bit crazy right now, but when we get to really crazy looking problems in your, like in your homework, that's when drawing these little arcs really help you out. Okay? So let's look at some practice problems. When I'm looking at practice problems and I'm asking myself how to solve them, I have to ask, what is the relationship between the 2 angles that I'm looking for? Okay? So if I look at this angle, this problem up here, if we call this number 1, all right? These 2 angles form a right angle, right? So that means these 2 angles are complementary. So that means these 2 angles must add up to 90 degrees. So I would take 90 minus 68 to equal my missing angle. And that is 22 degrees. Okay? Look at the next one. These 2 angles, I need to determine a relationship about them. When I don't really know what to do, I'm going to try drawing my semicircle. Notice when I connect that arc from that angle and I connect that arc from that angle, it also makes a semicircle. So I know this one is either supplementary, or you could call this one a linear pair. So I would take 180 minus 129, and that would equal the angle that I am missing. Okay? So, with your calculator, type it in. Tell me what you got. I'm going to leave it up to you to be able to give me that answer. So let's look at the next one. What do you notice about the relationship on these 2 angles? Notice they make a linear pair. So these 2 angles have to add up to 180 degrees. So I'm going to combine like terms. I'm going to take 4x plus 6 plus 11x minus 6. That's going to equal 180 degrees because this is supplementary or it's a linear pair. Okay? So now, let's combine like terms. We have 15x, my 6's cancel out, equal 180. So I'm going to divide 15 by 180. So x equals 12. All right, so let's plug them in and find them back again. So we have 4 times 12 plus 6. We get 54 degrees. And we have 11 times 12 minus 6. 126 degrees. And when you add those 2 up, 54 degrees and 126 degrees, you should get 180 degrees because they are supplementary or a linear pair. This last problem, we can have multiple different ways I can solve this problem. Okay, there's 2 ways. Sometimes people can argue with more than 2 ways. And you can't see what I'm doing, but I'm going to pretend my highlighter tool, I'm going to cover this up. So I want you to cover that up with your hand right now. Okay, so if I cover that up with my hand, I want you to notice 2x and 3x make a 90-degree angle. What is the vocabulary word for 90-degree angle? Complementary. So these 2 angles would be complementary. So I could take 2x plus 3x to equal 90. So then I would have 5x equals 90. So what does x equal? 18. Or I can solve this another way. If I uncover up that ray, notice these three angles make a supplementary angle trio. So I could take 2x plus 3x plus 90 degrees to equal 180 degrees. So I have 2x plus 3x plus 90 equals 180 degrees. Notice you're going to get the exact same answer. Okay. Also notice I'm not putting degree signs next to x because x is a variable, not an angle. So be very careful. 2 times 18 is 36. That's an angle, so that gets degrees. 3 times 18 is 54 degrees. And if you add these three angles up, you get 180. Now be very careful. These three angles make supplementary angles, but they don't make a linear pair, because a linear pair, they have to be adjacent, and this angle right here is not adjacent to this angle right there. Okay? So looking at the bottom two problems, I want to see if you can figure them out on your own. So I am going to surpass this, but I recommend pausing the video, practice, and then going over it as a class. So let's keep going. First question says, find the measure of the missing angles. Okay, so this one might be a little hard to read, but that says 25 degrees. Okay, and that one's 55 degrees. So I have to take my knowledge on my 5 vocabulary words at the top of the other side of the paper to figure this out. So if this angle is 25 degrees, I also know this angle right here is 25 degrees because they're vertical angles. If I were to draw my fish, they would look like they were kissing. 155 degrees I know is this angle right here. This angle right here is congruent to that angle right there because they are also vertical angles, so it makes 155 degrees. Name one acute angle. There are two. You can say angle ROB. You can also say angle KOZ. You could also flip them. Angle BOR, angle ZOK. An obtuse angle, I have ROK, or KOR, or I have angle BOZ. Okay. Now it says to name a pair of adjacent angles. Remember, adjacent angles are angles that share a common vertex and they also share a side. So if I want to highlight BOZ, let's just start with BOZ. There's multiple different arrangements we can have here. But angle BOZ is adjacent to either angle KOZ, because these angles share a vertex and they share a side. So I can write that one. I can also say angle BOZ is adjacent to angle ROB because they share the vertex and the side. But be very careful. Are these two angles adjacent? No, because they share a vertex, but they do not have a side in common. Okay? Now there are multiple other answers I could put here. Those are the only two answers that I wrote. So now let's get to the more tricky part. When I have to find x and y in a problem, I have to first be very careful with where I start, all right? And I have to look at the angle relationships to be able to set up an equation, because that's my end goal here, is to get that equation to be able to find x and y. So if I'm using my vocabulary words, I want you mainly to focus on linear pair and vertical. Let's check some stuff out. If I look at this angle right here and this angle right here, these two angles are vertical, right? Vertical angles are congruent. So what does congruent mean? Equal. So if I were to set 4y equal to 9x plus 5, I would not be able to solve this equation. I cannot solve this equation because I can't have two unknowns in one problem. So that's not going to help me. So where I need to start is where my variables are the same. So okay, 16x and 9x plus 5, they have the same variable. So what's the relationship about these two angles? Notice I can draw my semicircle. So that means it's a linear pair. So I'm going to say 16x plus 9x plus 5 equals 180. Why does it equal 180? Because that's the definition of a linear pair. So now I'm going to combine my terms. 25x plus 5 equals 180. 180 minus 5, I get 175. Divide by 25, x equals 7. All right, so now how am I going to find y? Because my directions say to find both. So let's plug it in. 16 times 7 is 112 degrees. 9 times 7 plus 5 is 68 degrees. Okay, so now with my information that I have, I need to determine how am I going to be able to solve for y. So I know I'm using 4y, because that's the one that I need. So I know this angle here and this angle here are vertical angles. So I can set them equal to each other, because vertical angles are congruent. So I can say 4y equals 68. Because if this angle is 68 degrees, this angle also has to be 68 degrees. So 68 divided by 4. Y equals 17. Look at the next one. Where do I want to start? I want to start where my x's are the same. So notice these two angles, they both have x. What's the relationship about these two angles? They are a linear pair. What do I know about a linear pair? They equal 180 degrees. So I'm going to add these up. So if you want to add it up in your head, go for it. 19x plus 9 equals 180. So now I have 19x equals 171. X equals 9. Am I done? No. I have to find y now. So let's plug it in for x. 9 times 9 plus 2 is 83 degrees. 10 times 9 plus 7 is 97 degrees. You might also want to double check and make sure these two angles equal 180 degrees. So okay, so now let's try to figure this out. Using these two angles, how am I going to figure out y? You can set this up a couple different ways. You can either do these two and tell me that this makes a linear pair. So that means they add up to equal 180. Or you can tell me this angle and this angle are vertical angles. What do I know about vertical angles? They are congruent. So how do I set up an equation? I make them equal to each other. So I have 18y plus 25 equals 97. So I have 18y equals 72. So y equals 4. So when you're solving problems like this, you want to determine the relationship that they have to determine whether you're making the equation equal to 180 or if you're making the equation equal to each other. You are going to solve the bottom two problems. Notice the fourth problem here doesn't have a y, just solve for x. When you finish, talk about it as a class, and then you should be good to go.